wouldn't it be nice to have several thought leaders in your industry know and love your brand? Start a podcast. Invite your industry's thought leaders to be guests on your show, and start reaping the benefits of having a network full of industry influencers. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. We're here today with Ken McElrath, founder and CEO at Skuid. Ken, how are you doing today?
Doing fantastic.
That's good to hear. Ken, we are really excited to have you on the show today. I've been following some of the growth at Skuid, and you have some attributions to your name in being a top-rated CEO on Glassdoor. So love to hear your thoughts on building a company culture. And I think some of the things we're going to get into are going to be some great practical takeaways for our audience. But before we jump right into that, Ken, I'd love to give people a little bit of a frame of reference. Would you mind sharing with the audience what you and the team at Skuid are up to these days?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. So we are a platform for building applications that connect to any database or data source. And you can build essentially any application for any purpose without writing code.
Interesting. A lot of applications for a lot of different folks these days. You know, app development is hot, but it's not always an easy process. So you guys are doing some great stuff there. Well, let's jump right in, Ken. Going off of one of the things that you guys have been pretty successful with at Skuid is, defining and then building the company culture that has been pretty key to your growth. As we were talking offline, you mentioned, the first thing that anyone's got to do, whether you've got, a team of 5 or, way up from there, is you've got to define what sort of culture you want to create. Can you tell us a little bit about, what you think on that point before we get into kind of how you've approached it?
Sure. Yeah. I think the most important thing is that you be intentional. When we launched this company, we said, hey, we want this to be a fantastic culture to actually recruit and retain the right people. Mm-hmm. And so that intentionality is something that you don't see a whole lot of in a lot of companies. And so we set out to say, hey, let's define this, let's build it, let's build the kind of company that we've always wanted to be a part of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as we were talking, we kind of laid out this more or less 3-step framework that you guys have followed, and some really interesting examples I think our listeners are going to take some practical advice from as you guys have built this. We were talking about an exercise that you guys went through. Once you were intentional about the type of culture you wanted to build, you went through an exercise of how to identify people that are going to fit into that culture. Can you share with us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, sure. So I think early on, we started to hire people. Actually, our defining word was, hey, don't hire somebody that you wouldn't want to go out with for an evening, or that you wouldn't want to sit next to at the company Christmas dinner. And
right.
that did okay for the first year. But then what we did as an exercise as a senior leadership team, we sat down and said, look, we need to get this really whittled down to kind of like the top 3 things that we're looking for in employees. Mm-hmm. So we did a brainstorming exercise where I asked each of the leadership team to write down 3 people that they thought represented the character of our company or the soul of our company. And we didn't share those names with each other. We just wrote them down on a piece of paper. And then step 2 was now write down the characteristics of those three people.
Mm-hmm.
And so each leadership team member wrote all of those things down. Step 3 was we put all of those characteristics up on a whiteboard and said, are there overlaps? And it turns out there were a lot of overlaps. And so we started whittling down those characteristics and said, okay, let's get rid of all the ones that are kind of table stakes, right? So honesty, great. That's table stakes. Everybody wants to hire an honest employee. That doesn't really differentiate our culture.
Right. That would probably exclude them from the hiring process in the first place anyway, right?
Exactly. So once we whittled them down, we really came up with the top 3, and then we had to kind of wordsmith those. And what we realized was unique about our culture is that the people that we hire represent a paradox, right? So for instance, example, one of our characteristics that we came up with was we're looking for humble experts, which sounds really odd, right? If you're hiring just for experts, that's pretty easy. You just look at the resume, and if they've done, this like coding language or whatever, you know that they're an expert in that particular thing. But how do you hire somebody who's an expert and also is humble?
Mm-hmm. Especially when those two characteristics often, disqualify each other from being present in the same individual, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's the same for the other 2 characteristics we came up with as well. One of them was a caring hero, right? And so often when you think of a hero, you think of somebody like Tony Stark, who creates a lot of collateral damage. They get a lot of stuff done, but, in the process, they trash a city. So how do you find somebody who can really get stuff done and really kick butt, but at the same time, they care for others and bring them along in the journey, so that they are actually protecting people in the process of getting stuff done. So they seem to be opposites, but the people that we had hired initially really represented that paradox, and we wanted to find more people like that.
Yeah. And then, so step 1 for you guys was defining the culture that you wanted to create, going through this exercise of, okay, who are folks that we know that are ideal candidates if we were looking outside today of people that internally, because I think you make a great point. A lot of people start with that idea of, okay, let's build a team around people that we could go have a beer with or that we could spend an evening with. But once you get over a certain threshold, that doesn't quite cut it anymore, because you can't just hire your friends, because then you need specialists in different areas. And so how do you boil it down to some characteristics that work across departments and things like that?
Mm-hmm.
So then from there, as you guys boiled these down, you talked to me a little bit about what you guys do from there to try and uncover those characteristics, right? Because you can't just ask someone, are you humble? You've got to find a way to weave that into your hiring process. What were some of the things that you guys did to try and uncover those without, just overtly asking, because that wouldn't have been really effective? Right.
So what we tried to do is get at the essence of what those words actually mean. So if you try to once you start digging into humility and understanding what humility really is, you can start building out a set of interview questions to try to reveal that. And like you said, you can't just say, hey, are you humble? Because what's somebody going to say, right? If they say they're humble, they're bragging. It's crazy. So what you do is you say, well, what represents humility? And one of the big things with humility is that you're willing to admit your mistakes and your failures.
Right.
And you can actually learn from them. And so the natural question that came up in the interview process is, tell me about one of the biggest mistakes you made and how you dealt with it. And it leads to some very good questions. And if somebody says to you, I haven't really made any mistakes, you know that they're not humble. And if they say that they've made a mistake and then they beat themselves up for it, that's not a good thing either. So you're looking for, how did they respond? How did they apply their expertise to overcome the impact of their mistake? Did they talk to other people about it? Did they bring in team members to help them overcome it? All of those things represent humility. If you try to solve the problem only by yourself, that means that you're not willing to, bring others into the mix and admit your faults. You're trying to hide something, right? So when you start drilling into what happens when somebody is not humble, you start to see a lot of the dysfunctions that occur typically in an organization. And so we're trying to avoid those dysfunctions, and we think humility can help us avoid them. And so that's what we're trying to drill into. And so if you look at our interview questions, they all emerge from our top 3 characteristics of a potential employee. And we've taken a whole lot of time and energy to ask those questions to reveal those characteristics.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like, you get a range of answers to a question like that, but you have more or less a framework or at least some experience in analyzing those answers. So kind of which way to take them, even though it's not a yes, no question, because you can't uncover that characteristic with that yes, no question. You can build a framework for kind of analyzing and thinking about those responses. So I think that's great practical advice for a lot of our listeners, wherever they're at in their stages of, building a team and building a culture. One of the things we talked about offline as well, Ken, was, everyone wants to build a winning culture, and a lot of folks have done that well to a point. But what I like in, what you shared with me at the team at Skuid and some of the things that you guys are doing to maintain that culture. Once you've decided what you want it to be, you've created some processes for building it. How do you go about maintaining it? And a lot of folks are creating these, happy hour style events for their companies or different ways to just create more camaraderie and socialization within the team. But, you guys have done some things differently in the way that you approach that have helped you maintain culture. So I'd love for you to share a couple of the specifics around how you guys do that and the way that you have tweaked that a little bit to maintain this culture that you guys have built.
So I'll talk about, one of the aspects. One of the big things that we value here is transparency and just consistent communication. And so we have, the all hands meetings that we do quarterly, but we've augmented that with all hands meetings on a monthly basis. And then we actually meet every week. And so we used to have this thing called Fab Fridays, right, where everybody would show up late on a Friday night. We'd do a happy hour, and then I'd report out on all the crazy stuff that had happened during the week while everybody was enjoying themselves. We made 2 switches to that. One was we moved it to Thursdays, and the reason for that was we found that a lot of people had families. They wanted to get home on Friday nights, and so Friday night wasn't really the best time to do it. So we moved it to Thursdays and call it Thirsty Thursdays. And then the second thing we did was we started letting our people run it. So instead of me getting up and doing shout outs and that sort of thing, we said, hey, why don't we let individual departments run it? And then it became individuals who said, hey, I want to run it this week and I want to do something kind of different. And what that does is it gives them the opportunity to own it as an event, to express their own unique personality and way of doing things, to provide different kinds of food. Everything. And so the ability to allow each employee or groups of employees to express themselves in their unique way and have that contribute to the culture has proven to be a positive decision.
I love 2 things there. One, that, you're being intentional about the unintended consequences of, when and how you were doing the meetings, because even if the content is great, there could be things that are affecting it in a negative way. So you guys were kind of tuned into that and made a little shift. And then, you're giving the team ownership and giving them, the ability to run it, which changes the dynamic quite a bit, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a lot more fun now. And plus you get to meet new people who maybe you haven't met before and experience their personality and find out what's important to them. We had one guy ran it last week, and he got up and it was all about sandals. He said, what other company have you been involved in that allows you to wear sandals to work? And he actually encouraged everybody to wear sandals that day. And I'm like, I never would have thought of that. It's just nuts what they come up with, but it's a lot of fun too.
Yeah. Yeah. We've got an interesting parallel there. Our founder, has talked before about, judging the quality of life by the number of days you spend in flip-flops. So we kind of joke about that. So good to hear another good flip-flop story being had in company meetings elsewhere. Awesome. Well, Ken, this has been a great topic. I think a lot of people are tuned into this idea of how do you build and maintain culture. So we really appreciate you sharing some specifics that have worked for you guys at Skuid. Ken, if people would like to stay connected with you, follow what you guys are up to, either personally or with the company, what would be the best way for them to go about doing that?
the best way would be to check out our website at skuid.com, spelled with a K. So it's skuid.com, and that's the jumping off point for everything else.
Awesome. Well, Ken, thanks for being our guest today. We really appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed the conversation. And
Sure.
Before we let you go, we wanted to give a shout out to the Flip My Funnel conference that's coming up just a few weeks away, guys, in Boston on August 8th. The guys at Flip My Funnel are putting on another great conference this year. And for B2B growth listeners and guests tuning into this as well, then you can use the promo code B2B growth when you go to get those tickets and get 50% off the price of admission. I've seen the speaker lineup. It's going to be a lot of great topics around ABM and other marketing topics that are hot right now. So if you go to flipmyfunnel.com, use the 2018 conference link. When you go to get those tickets, use the promo code B growth when you go to checkout, and you'll get 50% off of those tickets. And we look forward to seeing a lot of our listeners and a lot of our former guests in Boston.
There are lots of ways to build a community, and we've chosen to build the B2B growth community through this podcast. But because of the way podcasts work, it's really hard to engage with our listeners. And without engagement, it's tough to build a great community. So here's what we've decided to do. We're organizing small dinners across the country with our listeners and guests. No sales pitches, no agenda, just great conversations with like-minded people. We'll talk business, we'll talk family, we'll talk goals and dreams. We'll build friendships. So if you'd like to be a part of a B2B growth dinner in a city near you, go to b2bgrowthdinners.com. That's b2bgrowthdinners.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.